Okay, starting out with the background on this guy, I am layering in my light blues first. I cannot give you a list of the colors I used because this was last winter and I have no idea at this point. But the main thing that you want to focus on is just keeping your values correct. Your light's light enough and your dark's dark enough. I'm using a very light hand, and you can tell, look how far back my hand is on that pencil. I am not pushing very hard. I'm just doing small circles. It does not look like it here, but I'm doing small circles and I'm working back and forth in several directions just to make sure that I've got good color saturation or coverage. Coverage is a better word. Let's go with that one. So, and you can see I am keeping the circles pretty much in the shape that I'm going to want them. I can work over them later by pulling white back over if I go too dark, but it's going to be a lot easier if I just go light enough to start with. And as I work, I will start layering my darks over my lights slightly. I don't want the lines or the circles here to be too harsh. You can tell this was done in the winter because I have Christmas lights on my nails. I forgot about that stamp. You care. I know you're glad I shared. But I'm just going to continuously build up varying shades of blue. I'm probably using 3 or 4 different blues at this point. You can see I do my light first and then I pull the dark in between. Now I am keeping my edges of my feathers very sharp. So while I want the edges between the light and the dark and the circles to be light, the feathers are outlined very, very well. I want that very defined. So harsh lines there. When you're doing stuff like this, especially a background where you do want it to be very smooth, don't scribble. If you can see a whole lot of straight lines all over the place going in random directions, that is going to show in your finished piece, even if you do a lot of layering and end up blending with a paint thinner. Now here I came back through with my white luminance and tried to block in where the snow was going to be. Because of the technique I ended up using later on, which I'll talk about that later, I didn't end up needing to do that. That ended up being a bit of a waste of time. If I were to do this again, this section right now where I'm trying to circle and go around the little white dots, I would just put blue right over it and not worry about it. Now, I'm not doing just straight lines around the edges of the feathers. They're slightly sketchy on the bottom section so that I have the tooth or the texture of the feather. You can see the outer edges are smooth, but down at the bottom it's slightly frayed, and so I've got the little sketchy look in there. Now even here, I can see I'm going in too many different directions and I have too many straight lines all over the place. I'm going to have to work extra hard to correct that because I was sloppy and lazy as I did that. Especially the dark blue that's right above the branch. I can see a whole lot of straight lines that really ideally should not be there right now. Now the easy fix is going to be to just take the blue again and layer on top of that in small circles. I'm not sure why I got lazy there. It's always a joy to look back at older work. Again, I'm working at trying to keep the little white circles there for where the snow is going to be falling. If I do something like this in the future, I wouldn't bother with that. I would use the melting wax or the Prismacolor pencil. I know Prismacolor. You guys know I don't like Prisma, but I ended up using it for this. I would use that technique again, which I guess I can tell you about now, given that this is going to take forever to block in. What I ended up doing to create the spray of snow on there is taking a Prismacolor pencil, and I used Prismacolor for 2 reasons. 1, it's wax. 2, it's cheap. I'm not going to do this with my more expensive Luminance pencils. And first I tried shaving it off with an X-Acto knife, spreading it out where I want it on the paper, and then sticking it in the oven. Problem is you can't really get it hot enough, and I started to burn the paper before I actually got the wax to melt. What ended up working for this is to take an iron and use a lot of pressure over wax paper, and I pushed it down. That still didn't feel was the best technique, so I spent some time trying a little bit harder, and I did make a video showing you guys exactly how I do it with this roller thing and the Prismacolor art sticks, so they're even easier to shave down for getting the spray, whether it be seafoam or in this case snow. So I will try to remember, I know I say this all the time, but I'm really going to try hard to remember to put a link to that video showing you guys how to get that technique. Now, you can just work on one teeny tiny area at a time if that seems easier for you. For this, because I needed so much of the same colors through the entire background, I just layered my blues over all of it to get it out of the way. And I generally start with my backgrounds first for two reasons. One, I think it makes it easier for me to judge the values in my subject, which is the part that I care most about. Two, I hate doing backgrounds. It takes so long to get that much coverage on the paper with a colored pencil. So I like to get it done first so that when I am finished with the owl, if I do the owl first and come back and do the background later, chances are I'm gonna rush through the background. And it is so important to make sure that you put all the time necessary in your background. My backgrounds usually take me longer than the subject matter by quite a bit. Every square inch of your paper is just as important as every other square inch. So if you suspect, like I do for myself, that I would end up getting lazy and rushing over something, I'm going to do that first and get it out of the way when the whole project is more fresh and I'm not in such a rush to finish it. I know when I get towards the end of a project, I just want it to be done. If I'm working on the subject, the owl, then I'm having more fun, and so I'm not as likely to rush. Now, if I were painting, I will always do my background first so that I can layer different things on top and not worry about messing up my subject as I blend. But with colored pencil, you're pretty free to work on any single area without messing anything up, as long as you're putting paper or something under your hand so that you don't smudge your previous work. I recommend glassine. This video was before I started using glassine, so if I do use something under my hand, it's probably going to be tracing paper. But that will protect your paper from getting the oils of your skin on it or smudging. And I find that wax-based pencils don't smudge as much and get all over my hand as much as the oil-based pencils do. You can see I've got a very sharp line by that wing there, but then again, I'm overlapping my blues in that background. And I'm being sloppy again. I've got lines and straight lines all over the place that shouldn't be there. I should be using smaller circles to keep that nice and smooth. I am not sure why I got so sloppy on that. It all worked out in the end, but then I had to work extra hard layering on top of layering to get rid of those lines later on. So I definitely could have made them easier on myself by taking a tiny bit of extra time and working in smaller circles and overlapping them so that that background was very, very smooth. I hate when I catch myself doing things badly. Now you can see at this stage, it looks like crayon. It doesn't look smooth, and this is one of the things I hear most often from people who are working in colored pencil and trying to get that smooth blending, is that they can't get it as smooth as mine. This is just the first layer. This is the first of many, many layers. So it's not going to look great. Even when I start coming back through with a paint thinner, it's not really going to be terribly well blended and smooth. You're still going to see the white grain of the paper in many of these places, and it's going to have a rough look until I add more layers and then blend it out again with paint thinner, then add more layers and blend it out with paint thinner. This is a very, very long layering process, and you just want to continuously layer until you get it to look the way that you want it to. And if you're applying the pencil with a very light hand, you're not going to limit yourself. You can add so many layers that way. If you start pushing really hard, you will damage the tooth of the paper, and that will limit how many layers you're able to add. See, not even blending yet, I'm already going on top of that again. And I'm taking this blue and I'm going on top of both the light and the dark blue. What this is doing is pushing both of those colors closer together so they're not so harsh, and it softens out that background. And there I'm being pretty messy too. What the heck was with me that day? Why was I being so lazy? So at this point, I probably have, this layer is probably my 4th or 5th layer of pencil on the paper. Still without having blended out yet. If you don't have enough pencil on the paper, when you blend with paint thinner, it's not going to do a whole lot. You need a lot of that pigment on your paper. That lime green pencil that you saw there was actually the Faber-Castell ink eraser. That's the one from Mexico, so the casing on that is different than the cream colored ones you'll find here in the US. And that was because I was still trying to keep those white dots clean before I decided to do that shaving, melting wax thing. Darkening up some of the dark areas even more. Now I've switched and I started holding the pencil to the side when I blended over the light areas. This kept me from going too dark, but I still was able to get it to blend a little bit between the light and the dark. If I used the tip of the pencil with this color, I found that I was going darker than I wanted on those light areas, so by holding it to the side, that helped me to control how much pressure I was adding. Of course, that will also give you more of a grainy, gritty look, but because I have so many layers on here already and I knew I was going to blend with the paint thinner, it really wasn't a big deal. I just wanted that hint, kind of a stain of that color on top of the lighter circles. This video was shot on my old camera, so it's not quite as clear as the videos you guys are used to seeing me do now. And it's a bad angle because it was also my old tripod. So I'm using a fairly stiff brush. This isn't my usual Taklon filbert brush. This one is slightly stiffer. I'm not sure what type of bristle it is, but it works a little bit better for my first layer because I had so much area to cover, and I was able to kind of scrub it a little, the paint thinner into the paper a little bit more. So that gave me a smoother look, which helped get rid of some of those heavier pencil lines that I had because of me being so sloppy in the application of my first few layers. I don't use this brush that often, but when I have a really large area to blend and I want it to be really smooth, it does work pretty well. Unfortunately, I have no idea where to get another one because I bought it when it was on clearance. Okay, I stopped being lazy. I looked it up. It's a low Cornell and it says natural synthetic. That is not that helpful. And it is a 247, well, the smaller version. I have a large and a small version of this. The smaller one says 247 Crescent. I have no idea if that will help you guys out or not. But I don't actually use that one that often anymore. Normally I just stick with the Taklon bristled brushes that you see me use all the time. So now I've switched over to my Luminance pencils because I want this to be more opaque. And I will use my Polychromos where I want some of the darker colors, and I do what's more of a glaze because the Polychromos are more translucent. But where here I'm trying to get this to be more solid and more opaque in some of these areas, the Luminance works really well. But if you only have one brand or the other, you can get this look to look almost exactly the same using just Polychromos or just Luminance. With the Polychromos, I would just do more layering to get it more solid. I'm taking this color and pretty much going over everything, again pushing my darks and my lights closer together, which helps me in making it look like it's farther away and more blurry. Now I'm again with the luminance pencils, and I'm adding a slightly darker color into the mix. By doing so many different layers of so many different colors, it helps me to build up more depth so that the end result doesn't look flat. I mean, you can do something similar with just 2 pencils or 2 colors, but you're not going to have the depth that you will as if you were mixing several colors and overlapping them like this. Notice how it fades from the light to the dark. It's not just dark and then light. There's a slight transition between the lights and the darks, where you get kind of a medium blue color. Yay for working off camera. I am so good at that. The one thing that I do like about my old camera versus the new camera is I never had the lines going through the screen like I sometimes get now. Now I really have to remember to watch out for that. If I adjust my light, I can keep it from happening, but sometimes I forget. And I didn't realize what a big difference there was in the camera angle until looking at this one now. And here I'm still trying to go around those circles, and it was about this point that I started realizing that wasn't going to work. I wasn't keeping enough of them white. If I was working slower, I could have, but it just wasn't worth the trouble. That was so many white dots for the spray of snow that I wanted. And with colored pencil, white is not, it'll lighten the paper, but it will never get back to completely white like with paint. With paint, I can go back on top if I want seafoam or the spray with snow. I can take another brush and either flick the paint onto the canvas or dot it however I want, but it will show up. With colored pencil, it's too translucent, so it really doesn't show up and it won't be as hard, the contrast won't be enough there. So just taking a white pencil and going on top of the blue wouldn't have done enough for me. It would lighten it, but it wouldn't really look like snow, and I wouldn't have had that three-dimensional look. I'm starting to add purples into my background as well. Now, I think on doing it on white animal especially, it, for me, makes it so much easier. Just one added bonus to getting my background in first. If I were to leave that background white, chances are I wouldn't go dark enough on the whites in the owl. Most of it really isn't that white. It's varying shades of grays and blues. But because now I have the blue in there, it's going to be so much easier for me to judge my values. Now I'm better defining my circles. Again, I still want them to be soft. I just want you to see that there are a lot of, to have that bokeh look. Bokeh? I don't know how to say it. I think you guys know what I mean. Again, I'm still using a very light hand as I apply the pencil to the paper. This background took me 2 or 3 days. It's an 11 by 14 inch, and it took 2 or 3 days to get the coverage that I wanted. Lots and lots of layering. I'm usually a little bit messier on my first layers, and I start refining things and being a lot more careful about pencil strokes as I build up. But I still would recommend be a little bit cleaner than I was on this one. Early on, you saw how many pencil strokes there were there. While I was able to get rid of them, it can be a lot harder than just doing it in small circles and keeping everything very soft in the first place. And on this one, I am still using the Fabriano Artistico Extra White Hot Press 140 pound watercolor paper. If I were to do this piece again though, I might just choose to do it on Stonehenge, the individual sheets, not the paper purchased in the pads of vellum. But the Stonehenge is a little bit of a softer, well, it's quite a bit softer of a paper, but it makes it easier to get a smooth background. So if getting this look, I do think I probably would go with Stonehenge over the Fabriano Artistico if I were to do it again. I think it just would have made it a little bit faster and easier for that background. Now you can see I've blocked out a lot of what I just had there. I like to go way too light to start with, and then if I need to, I can darken things up as I go. But had I gone too dark here, there is no way I would have ever gotten it back light again. But I'm starting to come through and define where I want these dark areas so that it's just not one big solid mass of light everywhere. Adding purple over both the light and the dark blue. And I'm slightly overlapping my darks on top of my lights, just like I was earlier on, so that I get that fuzzy look. When you're going for a blurry background, the goal there is to have everything very soft. You can have it pretty busy. You just want the transition between your lights and your darks to be soft. You don't want a lot of sharp details. Keep your sharp details for your subject, and that will make your subject appear like it's really close so that you get that three-dimensional look. I would guess at this stage I probably have 10 layers of pencil on the paper. And it still looks grainy. That's okay. I will just keep layering until it doesn't. So again, you can see how very, very sharp the line is between my background and the owl's wings. I do not want that to be fuzzy. And I also don't want it to look like there's a ring around the wings. I don't want a light border all the way around or a dark border all the way around. I need to make sure if it is light next to it that that light goes right up to the wing, and areas that are dark go right up against the wing. If you end up with a border, I've seen this happen a lot where people are afraid to mess up or get too close to the owl, so they leave kind of a border and figure they'll go back through later and darken it up. But when they do that, it's so obvious that it was done separately, because your layering process just isn't the same then. So as you work, pull that color right up against your subject. And in this case, when I'm going for a blurry background and an in-focus subject, I want those lines to be very harsh between the background and the subject. Now I've switched to my Taklon bristled brush. This is the softer one, and I'm blending that out with paint thinner. Oh, nope, switched back to the first one I talked about earlier. Apparently it was too soft for my taste there. Now at this point, I'm not trying to get a super smooth blending like I would on skin. When you're transitioning your lights and your darks into skin, it has to be so smooth. You can't have any lines where something is a little bit darker than it should be because of the brushwork. So when I work on portraits, I'm more careful on the later layers not to have very much paint thinner on my brush. But on something like this, I can be pretty sloppy. I've got a ton of paint thinner on that brush. So the amount of paint thinner that you have completely depends on what you're doing and the look that you're going for. Usually, no matter what I'm doing, when I get to the later layers, I will start using less and less paint thinner. But on a portrait, it's especially, you really have to watch out for that. But when you're doing animals, it's not as big of a deal, because if you do have brush strokes, it just looks like fur or feathers. You can see each additional layer between blending and then adding more pencil, how much smoother everything gets. And here I'm taking the lighter blue and I'm overlapping that onto the darker blue. And then when I come through with the darks, I'll do the same. I'll overlap it onto the whites a little bit, or the lighter colors. This gives me a much softer look, but it takes so many layers to get there. Now I'm taking the white luminance and I'm better defining the inside areas of some of these lighter circles. And you can see, even though it's white, it doesn't come out actually white. It just lightens up whatever's behind it, which for this is perfect. I want to keep my whites for the snow and for the owl to make him pop out more. If I had wanted any of those circles in the background to be white, I would have needed to put white colored pencil. I would have used the white luminance first before I started layering the blues in to protect the paper from getting too much color saturation from the blues when I blend it out. But in this case, had I done that, my foreground would not have been separate enough from my background. And there's no magical recipe to layer this color and then it has to be this color next and then it has to be that color. I'm always mostly experimenting. If it doesn't look good the one way, I'll layer another color on top of it. But you don't need to overthink it or worry about everything like that. As long as your values are correct, that's really what matters. But the more layers that I add, and in this case, because I wanted so many varying shades of purples and blues, that was creating more depth for me. The thing to notice here is just how much I'm layering my lighter colors. I will layer over my darker colors, and then when I come back through with my darks, I transition that a bit onto the lighter colors to soften those edges. And no matter what colors I was doing or were to do this with, whether it be greens or reds, I would do the same thing. I would just keep layering the edges between my lights and my darks so that everything's really nice and soft. You can see I'm making the darker colors even deeper. Now what I'm doing is going through and taking some of these circles and darkening some of them up while leaving some of them lighter. And what this does is create that much more depth because the ones that are brighter appear to be closer. The ones that are toned down are further in the distance. You can see that they're there, they're just not so in your face. So this helps to create more of that depth that I'm going for. Again, back with the white, brightening up some of these. And I've got to be careful too that I don't go too bright white in any specific area of this. I can lighten some of these circles up even more than I have on the left hand side, but if I do, I'm going to pull attention away from the owl. Where you put your lights and your darks will completely control where the viewers are looking. So definitely be careful where you put your contrast. Like in this case, I wouldn't want to put a bright white circle in one of the upper edges or upper corners because it would draw the viewer off the page. So I want to keep my outer edges a little bit darker than what I have on the inner portions that are closer to the owl. Now, in a lot of these layers, it's not even just so much about adjusting the color, but getting a smoother look. Some of this is still very grainy. This is the older camera, so it's not as obvious, but there is a lot of that grainy, gritty look here that I need to get rid of. And so a lot of the layering that I'm doing here is just to get rid of that, not just to adjust color. One of the things that I find I really have to watch when I'm doing circles like this is not to make Mickey Mouse. It is so easy to do the 2 ears and then the head. So watch out for that when you're doing things like that. Clouds too. Just watch that you're not creating shapes that you don't want there. Years ago, and when I was living in California, I was painting out on my balcony in my apartment, and my neighbor came out and looked at the sky, and she goes, "Oh, that's really a cool pterodactyl that you've got there." There was no pterodactyl. Well, there was not supposed to be any pterodactyls in the sky. And when I backed up and looked at it, sure enough, there was a pterodactyl. And so I had to go back and adjust that. So when you're doing backgrounds, whether it be clouds or the blurry look like this, definitely check for that and make sure that you're not seeing shapes that shouldn't be there. I mean, I think if people look hard enough, they can see all kinds of stuff. But the pterodactyl was pretty obvious, and Mickey Mouse is pretty obvious. Again, notice where I've got dark, it goes right up against that wing, and then the same with the white. So I don't just have a dark outline all the way around or a light area all the way around. Okay, blending that layer out with paint thinner now. Now I am using that Taklon bristled filbert brush. I've switched to the softer brush because I do want this to be very soft. That other one, the scrubby brush that I was using earlier, is too harsh, and so it can move, especially the white areas, it can kind of start lifting some of that off the paper, which is not what I want here. I really want this to start being soft now. You've got to be careful when you're blending like this. I'm mostly going over everything, but I do have to watch that if I blend into a really dark area and then go straight into a light area, it's going to darken up the light area. You will drag the pigment from one area to another. So if that is something that you're finding happening a lot to you, keep an old like t-shirt or a Viva paper towel, either way you want to go, near your work, and you can rinse out your brush with the paint thinner because that is a brush cleaner. You can clean out your brush in between your light and your dark areas. Here, I'm wanting them to blend together a lot, so I can do that, but that is something that you want to watch for because it completely depends on the look that you're going for. You can really create mud if you're very sloppy with dragging the darks onto the lights and then the other way around. If I wanted to, I could blend just the light areas separate from the dark areas, and you wouldn't be able to tell that they were blended out separately. You don't have to blend over everything to keep everything soft. Unlike painting, where everything kind of has to be done wet into wet, that's not an issue here with colored pencil. And after that dried, more layers. You're shocked, I know. You can see at this point I have pretty much lost all those little white dots I was trying to keep. Yeah, that didn't work out too well for me. I got impatient and just blended right over everything. And by the white dots, I mean the spray of snow on the branch. Blending that last layer out again with paint thinner. You can see now this is all so soft and nice where there's no real harsh edges, but you can still see that there's circles, and you've got circles that stand out more and circles that are pushed back that are a little bit darker, but they're still all there. Using that white luminance again to pull out a little bit more of the lighter colors. And when I'm using the white luminance at this stage, I am adding more pressure. So I am coming pretty close to full-on burnishing at that point. If you're going to burnish or use a lot of the pressure like this, you want to save that for your last layers. Once you start burnishing, it's not going to take a lot more layering. The paper flattens out, so there's nothing for the pencil to stick to anymore. But it does give you a very nice blended look. So there's nothing wrong with burnishing to blend. You just want to save it for your final layers. I tend to hold my hand closer to the tip of the pencil when I'm burnishing or when I'm working on fine detail. When I'm keeping it really, really light, I keep my hand further away from the tip of the pencil. And when you hold your pencils, try to get out of the habit. I know a lot of people will hold their hand so close to the tip of the pencil that you can't even see the tip of the pencil anymore. Make sure you're not doing that, because you lose a lot of control in doing that. You can't really see where that tip is touching. So you lose so much control. Because I'm working upright, I end up using my left hand quite a bit to hold my right hand up so that it doesn't get too tired. That's why you see random fingers. Okay, finally done with that background, which was pretty much half of the time I spent working on this entire piece. So I'm not kidding when I say take your time on the background. It takes so long. So what I'm doing here is blocking in where my darks go and making sure to leave white where the solid masses of snow are going to go. I'm using various shades of brown and black. And some gray. This is another area that I recommend paying close attention to your reference photo. It doesn't need to be exact. I mean, if you've got a shadow in the slight wrong area, no one's really going to notice in the end. But if you can try to get as many of the details as close as possible, that will definitely lend to the whole piece looking more realistic. If you skip over and don't add the details needed in your branch or in other areas of your piece, it pulls down the whole thing. So no matter how good your subject looks, if you skip over an area, it definitely makes an impact on the whole painting or drawing. Now, anywhere where you've got snow or white animals, very little of it is going to be actually white. You've got it's so reflective. You'll have so many tones of blues and purples or whatever is in the background on there. But because I still have that high contrast between the dark next to it and the light there, it's still obvious that it's snow. Well, not really right now. Right now it just looks like an abstract shape, but it will be obvious that it's snow. And speaking of abstract shapes, that is a much easier way to look at things as you're working. If you can view things, just copy the shapes. Don't look at it as I'm drawing a branch. Look at it as here's a weird shape and brown comes out at a diagonal and then there's a little bit of black here and some white. It will make your end result look much more realistic. As you're working, it can kind of be a little bit confusing because it doesn't look like a branch at the time. But when you back away and look at it, everything comes together so much nicer that way. If you can keep reminding your brain to see the shapes accurately as shapes instead of just a branch. This is especially important when you're doing flowers because if you get a good reference photo of a flower where you have a lot of lights and a lot of darks where the light is hitting it in an interesting way, it looks like abstract shapes. I'm working on one right now that will be up in a couple weeks it'll be up next week for you guys. But that one with the leopard, the roses there, none of those petals looked like petals to me when I was working on it. You just want to look at them as abstract shapes. And that is definitely the case here with the snow and branches as well. So I guess we're kind of abstract artists. Not really. I'm using a smaller Taklon bristled brush for the smaller areas. And again, I've got to make sure that I clean that brush off or wipe it off in between blending the black areas and then the purple and light areas. Now, when doing the branches, I find I can be pretty sloppy with my pencil marks. You can see I've got a lot of straight lines all over the place. I'm wanting to create texture in here, and so I do not really care if I go too dark, too light, have lines where they shouldn't be in comparison to the reference photo. As long as I go for close, I'm okay. When I'm working on fur or a soft background, then it matters a lot more. But here, again, I'm going to want texture anyway, so I don't have to waste a ton of time being super smooth on the color here. As long as I've got solid color coverage, I'm okay. And you'll get to the point, the more pieces that you complete, you'll start to get a better feel for how much detail you really need to add or how careful you need to be in a certain area. Like when doing flowers. If one of my flower petals is slightly off, no one's going to know the difference. Unless I'm doing a challenge where everyone's doing the same thing, but I don't typically do those, so again, no one's really going to notice the difference. It's still going to be a flower. If I've still got the detail and the blending and everything soft and the lighting and contrast and all of that, that's what matters. So here, again with a branch, I am not going to waste a ton of time making sure every little teeny tiny thing is absolutely perfect. When I get into the owl, then I'll start getting more picky. But that doesn't mean that you can rush over or skip over it either. It's just a matter of figuring out, does it really matter if I'm a little too far to the left on this shadow? Usually, no. At least not on things like this. Again, when you do people and animals, then we've got to be picky. Because having your shadow slightly off will affect the actual bone and muscular the bone and muscular structure underneath the fur or feathers or skin. So then it really matters where each shadow is. On a branch, not so much. But that said, when you're first new to doing any subject, whether it be rocks or branches, I do recommend try to copy it as close as you can get it while you get a feel for it. Once you've done that subject or done lots of branches, lots of rocks, then you can feel a little bit more free to skip over certain areas or kind of rush through it a little bit more where you're not as worried about every little detail. Now, one of the things that you can't really tell on this because it's sped up is that I am letting the paper dry between using the paint thinner and going on to the next layer. If you rework an area that's still really wet, you can damage the paper. But this is the Fabriano Artistico and it dries pretty fast. Normally within half a minute or so. Now, if you are using paint thinner to blend, I do recommend make sure you're keeping a lid on it as you work. Don't just leave the whole thing sitting open. Not only does it evaporate faster, so that's pretty wasteful, and it does evaporate very fast, but it's also not the healthiest thing to be breathing in constantly. I've never had a problem health-wise as long as I leave a lid on it when I'm not actually using it. Taking a grayish brown color over part of this branch. That is one thing that I love so much about the Luminance pencils. They have some of the most beautiful tones of tans, browns, and grays. Coming on top with the white, not to make things white again, just to pull out highlights. I'm lightening up whatever I have underneath it. You can see it wouldn't work if I was trying to make it look like snow. It's not going to lighten up enough for that, but just to lighten up the brown, it works great. This is another area where it's pretty obvious looking at this as abstract shapes is way easier because all those lines are pretty weird. So I've outlined where I want the majority of those shapes to be first with the black, and then I can be pretty messy and just go right on top with that reddish brown. But that way I don't lose my lines. Because I know that most of those lines are going to be darker shadows, I can do that. And I pulled a lot of those orangey brown colors into this branch too, so that it complemented the blue in the background nicely. It just makes it pop out a bit more, having more of those orange tones. Blending those first layers out with paint thinner, then I will let that dry and start going back over with more details. And as I work, as usual, you'll see me continuously go back to areas that I previously had mostly finished. For me, it just works so much better when I give myself a break on a certain area, get it as close as I think it needs to be finished, and then move on to the next zone. And then I'll come back to that next one after I get a little bit further on, in this case, a little bit further on the branch. I'll go back to the beginning portion of the branch to add detail as needed. You absolutely do not have to do that. A lot of people like to do 1 square inch at a time. That works too. My mind just doesn't work that way. I think because I was an oil and acrylic painter before I really started taking colored pencils seriously, I still add or work in a very similar manner that I do with painting, where I like to layer larger sections. The main negative to working, jumping around as much as I do like this, is that you have quite a few stages where the whole branch in this case looks terrible until I get to the end. If you work 1 small square inch at a time, each of those small squares look great when you finish each one and move on to the next, because they are actually finished. Now I'm taking my white luminance and going over where the snow is going to be so that it's not too dark. It's not that you can really see that I put the white there, but that way I don't get too dark when I come on top with my purples. It just lightens everything up quite a bit. And here, like everywhere else, I go way lighter than I think I'm going to need to be, and I will continuously go back and darken it up as I work. But if I went too dark to start off, it would be really hard to get it as light as I'm going to need it to be. Blending that first layer out with paint thinner. You can see I'm pretty messy with it. I'm not worried about staying inside the lines. It's not that big of a deal because while it will smudge, it doesn't smudge that much. If you're having a hard time getting your brain to see things as abstract shapes as you work, try working upside down. Flip both your reference photo and your actual project upside down, and then it forces your brain to see things as shapes, so that your end result tends to be a lot more accurate. The big thing to notice here when doing the branches, they are not all one solid color. And then when I do have the highlights, it's not just a smooth line. This is something that I see people do quite a bit, where they add a highlight, it's like this smooth, even line, or the same with the shadow. Like one half of the branch has this even line going through. That would be the case if it was like a plastic fake branch that was perfectly smooth, but on something that has bark, you're going to have more natural tones and curves and ridges, and so nothing is going to be that perfectly smooth. The shadows fade in and out. If you look at the highlight on the underside of the branch, more on the left hand side, that one, look at how it's not even all the way across. Some areas come up further, some are down lower, some that highlight skips altogether. This helps to give your branch a much more natural feel. So often we're so certain that we know what branches look like that we think we can, adjust and make up our own branch out of our head without having a reference. But the lighting is usually what ends up wrong there. The way that even if you get the branch to where it's shaped kind of cool, the way that the lighting falls on the different parts of the branch ends up being off, and that's what makes it look more unnatural. So if you can go outside and find a branch and choose your light source, look at or I like to take photographs. Look at where the different branches cause shadow, like the smaller branches will cause shadows on the bigger portion of the shadow or the branch. And all of those random highlights and shadows that don't necessarily make sense, when it all comes together, that's what makes it look really realistic. When it's perfectly smooth, it makes it look very flat. And that is just not very interesting. If you do draw a branch, like a small section here, let's say you put black through the whole thing on accident, it's not the end of the world. It does not have to be perfect. Do your best to get some varying shades in there, but if it's not exact, again, nobody's going to notice, because chances are you're not going to run around showing people your reference photo and your finished project. So I laid the white luminance down first, and now I'm coming on top with the violet gray and adding in my shadows, the darker portions of the snow. Using the eyedropper tool in Photoshop or some other photo editing app really helps you to judge how light or dark your snow needs to go. Okay, that spray of snow there, that is what I was talking about. The best way that I found to do this is to I use the Prismacolor white. I got the art sticks. I actually got a 12 pack of those because they're pretty inexpensive, and you can use an X-Acto knife to shave it down into little crumbles. I then take those little crumbles and sprinkle it around on the paper. Then I take a piece of wax paper, cover it up, and take what is the word? It just escaped me. A embossing gun. That's the word. Take an embossing gun and go over it to warm it up, heat it up a lot. The reason that I'm putting the wax paper there is that will keep all of those little crumbles from spreading out all over the place. The embossing gun has a lot of force that comes out, and it'll just make everything spread out. So that wax paper kind of holds it in place. The next thing I do is take a roller. It's like a press roller. And as I'm applying the heat from the embossing gun and making sure to spread that around, if you go too hot in one area, you will burn your paper. So you have to be very careful with this. But practice on a scratch piece of paper, trust me. But you're going to take the rolling thing, and again, I will have a video showing you exactly how to do this. But roll it over the wax paper at the same time that you're applying the heat. So you're melting it, softening up the wax, and shoving it into the paper with the roller by adding a lot of pressure. I found that it was a combination of heat and the pressure from the roller to get it to stick well to the paper. But this gave me such a more natural spray than if I tried to work in between each one of those little dots. Now, those little dots will stick to the wax paper a bit, but it's still the best method that I found to get it to work. So I'm slowly building up the darker colors on the snow. But the important thing here, I don't want one solid mass there. I've got to make sure that I've got areas that are lighter and darker because the snow is semi-translucent. You've got shadows in there and different things that are going to create varying values. So it is really important to pay close attention to your reference photo in order to make it look realistic. If I went solid, even if it was a great color and it worked with the background, if I went solid lavender gray or solid blue, it would look super flat. And after the many days I have already put into this piece, that is the last thing that I want. It's especially important here because I do need this so light to start out lighter than I need to go and just build up until I get it as dark as I want. Using the white to strengthen some of the highlighted areas. I'm actually burnishing over those. I'm adding quite a bit of pressure for the areas that I want to be really light. You can see I'm using lots of different shades of blues and purples for my darker areas, and some gray. Now you can see my paper's moving quite a bit as I work. That is because I warped it just a tad while I was using the oven to try to melt the wax. Don't use the oven to melt the wax, by the way. You'll burn your paper far before the wax starts to melt. Once it was matted and framed, it was fine, but that's why you're seeing so much more movement in my paper now. Notice the slight shadow at the very bottom section where the snow meets the branch. Not just the shadow that goes under the snow, you want to make sure you get that too, but there's actually a little bit more of a shadow with the darker purples and blues right in between where it meets the branch. It's subtle, but it definitely needs to be there in order to create more of that three-dimensional look. Oh my gosh, I'm finally starting the owl. Nope, back to the branch. I almost got excited. I am taking that ink eraser by Faber-Castell and erasing some areas on the snow there to pull out the highlights. And the reason that this is working for pulling up the lights so much more is that I first put white down before I put the darker colors. If I had just put the blues and the purples, I'm not going to be able to get it as light as I can had I put, or like in this case where I put the white down first. The white protected the paper from being oversaturated when I blended out with paint thinner with the purples and the blues. So here I'm building up that shadow I was talking about between the branch and the snow. And getting a lot of little dots and circles in there to create the texture. I do not want that to be a perfectly smooth straight line. In most cases, the reason that snow looks flat when artists try to recreate it in paintings or drawings is just not getting the depth and the shading with the purples and blues. Okay, now it looks like I am back to the owl. Now notice when I put the white up against that tail, how much that white is showing up. It's because my tail ended up slightly discolored when I was trying to get all of the different techniques or trying so many different methods between the oven and iron to melt the wax. So there is a little bit of discoloration there. I don't know why I decided to test this melting the wax theory on my actual project. That was pretty stupid. I should have done that on a test paper first. This is one of those do as I say, not as I do things. Now here I start getting some sketchy lines where the edges of the feathers are frayed. So it is super important, pay attention to your reference photo, which direction those frayed lines go. You don't want them just all over the place randomly because that will not look natural. But look how many browns and grays that I'm using in here. It's not actually white. Very, very little of this owl will stay white. Making sure that I get the darks in here dark enough, that is what's going to create that illusion that light is coming from behind the flight feathers. And that's the main goal of this piece. I think most of you have already seen this one. You want to have that lighting right, and if you don't have your dark areas dark enough, then the light areas aren't going to have enough contrast that you really feel like the light is coming through the wings. So don't be afraid to go dark where it needs to be dark. And again, going back to using that eyedropper tool in Photoshop or whatever photo editing app that you want to use, it will really help you to see how light or dark you need to be on an area. I'm even surprised sometimes, and I'm usually pretty good at knowing what color I need, but using that, sometimes I'm surprised at how much darker an area is. Or I'll see something and be pretty sure that it's blue and it's really more of a brown tone. Depending on what color it's up against, it can give you an illusion that it's a color that it really isn't. So that's where that eyedropper tool is so handy. And blending that out with paint thinner. I'm using that blue just to add a little bit of detail around the edge of the feather to make it a little bit more frayed. On to the wings. This is the same thing. I used the blue to define that feather that needed to stick out a little bit there, but I'm using a lot of browns and grays and blues and purples. Very, very little straight white. And the owl ended up taking up less than half of the amount of time I spent on the rest of this piece. Oh, I do not miss these bad camera angles. And here I am still pretty much looking at things as abstract shapes, not as feathers, because that doesn't look anything like a wing or a feather at this point. So if I was trying to force it to, things just would have been a mess. So I want to copy my reference photo, make sure that where I've got certain pencil strokes, they have to follow the direction of the feathers there. The feathers are really soft in this area and fluffy. So I have to make sure they're going the right direction, but again, still looking at it as abstract shapes. Look how much dark goes in that white wing. And this isn't a case where I'm putting one solid color anywhere. I'm paying attention to the reference photo. Even though this is kind of a base blocking in colors, I'm still paying attention to my reference photo to make sure I'm putting blue where blue goes and purple where purple goes. If I just take a light blue over everything first, yeah, technically my end result could be the same, but I'm going to lose all of the lines for one thing that I had previously drawn out. By doing everything separately and blocking in the colors like this, it really helps me to keep my place. Every time that you see me stop and my pencil just holds still, I'm pretty much counting feathers to make sure I'm in the right place. I'm counting over on my computer screen that is next to me where my reference photo is, and then I'm counting the feathers just to make sure I'm in the right spot. I spend more time looking at my reference photo than I actually do working on the piece. So zooming in, you can see I still have that very gritty crayon look, blocking in more color or layering more in over that. Making sure if I have any harsh lines, they are going in the direction of the feathers. That is so, so important here. You can see if you look at this, you're not going to look at that and go, yeah, that's a wing. Those are feathers. Again, abstract shapes. And you want to watch your reference photo because you don't want to start forcing feathers to be where feathers really shouldn't, or the whole piece just doesn't look quite right. Blending that out with paint thinner. I'm using that stiffer brush that I used earlier on. More Christmas nails. Is it really sad that as I watch this, I'm looking forward to Christmas just so I can use those nail designs again? I think I need a life. And as always, I really do recommend that you keep a scratch piece of paper. In this case, I'm using Fabriano Artistico, so my scratch piece of paper is the Fabriano Artistico. But test the layering. Like here, I had layered that violet purple color, or violet gray color, and then I put gray on top of it so that it had the more neutral tone that I wanted. It still has a purple tint, but it's not too much. I have to test that out on my scratch piece of paper before I know what that's going to look like. I don't want to do it on my project and find out, whoop, that wasn't the right color or the right shade. So by having a scratch piece of paper where you can test some of these colors out, that makes a big difference. And the order that you layer them will make a big difference. If I put down the gray first and the purple on top of that, it's going to look very different than if I put the purple down and the gray on top of that. And I have definitely hit that, this looks like crayons stage. And if I was not looking at it as more abstract shapes, this would have driven me crazy because none of this looks like feathers yet. Blending that out again. I'm starting to get the softer look that I want. Now I'm going to start refining my details even more. Again, using that white, it lightens it, but it doesn't turn it back to completely white. And where I had gone too dark, I'm using that Faber-Castell ink eraser to lighten some areas up. And then when I go on top of those areas with white, they'll really stand out. I find that that ink eraser pulls off more colored pencil than the electric sharpener I used to use. Now, the only time I really find myself using the electric sharpener is with graphite pieces. I stick to the ink eraser for the most part whenever I'm working in colored pencil. More blending. Now most of the grainy gritty look is gone, so it's really the details that I've got to start focusing more on. Down to the flight feathers. Now these have some of the lightest areas on the owl, so I will end up using more white here. But what was happening is I know that the upper section of the wing that I was just working on, that is going to have to be darker. But until I get these flight feathers to the tone that I want, was having a hard time judging my values. So I'm going to skip down here and start getting the lighter zones in, and then I can go back up and finish the upper section of the wing. Anytime that you start feeling overwhelmed or like you're not really seeing what it is that you're supposed to be seeing, if you still want to keep working, try working on a different zone of the paper. In this case, I just moved down a notch, but either take a break and walk away from the piece for a little bit or work on another area. Give your eyes a little bit of a break, and it'll help you to see things that you may not have noticed when you stared at the same area for too long. Especially if you're like me and you sit really close, so your face is so close to the paper, it can be really easy to lose what you're looking at. Now, I keep using my hand to wipe away areas that I've used the eraser. That is a bad habit. You want to use a brush, like a drafting brush, something like that, even an old paintbrush. Use something like that to wipe away any of those shavings so that you don't smear your colored pencil. So I'm blocking in the lightest areas with white and then coming around those with the additional colors. I'm using this kind of bronze color, very pale color on those areas of the wing, which helps me in giving the illusion of the light coming through the wings so that they're backlit like this. Maybe even got a bit of a rose color in there too. A lot more colors than you might think you would use in a white animal. Or anything white. I mean, the snow is the same way. There's just so much color in there. I'm using that violet gray as usual, one of my favorite pencils, the Luminance Violet Gray. I'm using a lot on this piece. And if it makes it easier, you can break it down to one feather at a time. Blending that out again with paint thinner, and then I'm going to come on top and start putting more details. That pretty much gives me the base colors I need. Now I can start building up where I want more lights and more darks, in addition to those details. It's much more obvious to me now that the upper section of the wing can be a lot darker, now that I've got some of those lighter flight feathers in. So here I'm coming on top of most of what I've already done and darkening it up quite a bit. And if that is not dark enough, then those light feathers won't seem light enough. And this can be really, really scary to do because it is fairly high contrast, and that's a deep blue for what is to be a white owl. But that is what makes this stand out so much. It's the lighting on this piece that everybody seems to be drawn to. And to do that, you've got to make sure that you go dark enough on some of these areas. Don't be afraid of it. Use the eyedropper tool. Another thing that you can do is take a picture of your work and put it into Photoshop or whatever photo editor you're using. Put it right next to your reference photo. That can make it a lot easier for you to see if you need to go lighter or darker in any given area. Almost every single piece, as I'm working on it, when I get towards the end, that's what I do, and then I go back and make adjustments. The black leopard that I recently did, I did that a lot on, where in the photograph, it actually photographed with deeper blues, and I loved how that looked, so I went back to my piece and made it match how the camera had picked up the blues. But when you can load it into Photoshop and hype up the contrast or tone down the contrast, make adjustments to see if it looks better if you make certain changes. It's better to find out in Photoshop if something's going to look good than it is to do it on your paper and realize it looked terrible. And figuring out which colors you need, you will get to the point where you're not as dependent on using Photoshop or an eyedropper tool to figure out what colors you need. But that does come with time. It is going to get easier for you the longer that you're working on. I hear all the time from people where I will say use magenta or use purple here, and it sounds scary, like where are you seeing that magenta or that purple? But when you layer it in, it all makes sense when it's up against the color next to it, because the colors around it so completely affect what that color actually looks like. But if you feel a little overwhelmed by trying to understand what colors you should use and where, I promise it'll get easier the more projects that you complete. Now, I know I am not finished with the upper section of that wing by any means, but I'm going to stop working on that and go and move on to the head. That is going to help me to start building up my contrast better once I can see what's next to it. So I'm starting with the beak, which is one of the darkest areas, and then the eye. I've lined where my black is going to go. Now we'll take the lighter colors, block that in there. Lighten it up with the white. I burnished over that to lighten it up. Now there's no bright white highlight for the highlight on the eye, it's just a little bit of a hint, so I didn't need to let the white of the paper show through first. You can see I just smudged the white over it just a little bit, so I've got a tiny bit of shine, but there's no, how you so often see that bright white dot. That is not the case here. If I needed a white dot, I would have needed to let the paper stay showing through. As I move on to the feathers, I'm blocking those in with this gray color. I've got to make sure those feathers are going in the right direction. It is more important now than almost any other area I've worked on so far. I'm doing little sketchy lines so that they're going in the right direction, or I create that texture. It is almost 1 in the morning when I'm recording this, so I have a feeling I'm saying a lot of really backwards things. I apologize. Now I'm taking that white and going over everything, including the gray. I'm burnishing this so it's blending just from using this white pencil. Adding a lot of pressure so it softens up that gray. It softens my edges and it creates a more smooth finish. Like I don't have such a high contrast between the light and the dark there. Using that violet gray quite a bit. I'm taking this blue and going right over where I've done the white and the gray. Again, pushing that gray down further because I don't want it to be that sharp. Not everywhere anyway. And here's another area. I've got to go super dark on a lot of the areas of his face, her face. I think this is a her. I wanted that highlight to stand out a little bit more, so I used my ink eraser, pulled some of it off, and then went back over it with the blue and outlined it with the black to darken areas up because I don't want it to be too bright there. Making my little sketchy marks for the feathers on the chest. You want to make sure I'm not just putting, in this case, random lines all over the place. Copy your reference photo. Burnishing white right over all of that to soften that down. Soften it up. Something like that. And you can see putting the white on top of the gray like that, it just created a completely different look. I've softened it and tinted the color better. So my lines aren't so harsh now. Adding my shadows with the purples and grays and blue. This is another area where you think, I'm painting a snowy owl, I need all white, and there's just so much shading in here, so many different colors. Blending all of that out with paint thinner. Now as I start to build up these darks, look how much those feathers on the left, the flight feathers there, how much the lighter ones are just almost glowing. They're not straight white. I've got that golden bronze color mixed in there, but they stand out because of the feathers around it being dark. If I didn't get those dark enough, it doesn't matter how light I have these flight feathers, they won't have that glowing look. Well, that's really blurry. Come on, focus. I'm going back through and hyping up my contrast even more. The thing here where I'm coming on top with the black, I don't want all of those gray areas to be black. I just want certain spots of it to be darker. And this helps me to create more of a realistic look in those feathers so that they're not so flat, because you're still able to see the light and dark spots. Or the lighter gray and dark spots, I should say. I've got a little bit of brown mixed into some of those as well. It would be great if this camera would focus. I'm hyping up the contrast a whole lot more than what I had all around, making my blues more bold and the purples. Seriously, camera, focus. You can see I'm pulling out to make the face show up more. I'm hyping up the contrast in the wing that's right next to it. It's not that the face needed to be lighter to stand out, it's that the wing next to it needed to be darker to push the face forward. Again, coming on top with the black on some of those gray specks that I had previously put in. It's a Christmas miracle. It's in focus again. Again, notice you can still see areas of the gray. I don't want to cover up all of those gray specks. And I still have to make sure that all of my little pencil lines are going in the right direction. If I just do a bunch of straight lines all over the place, I'm going to flatten out the bird's chest, which is definitely not what I want to happen here. I'm taking some of this brownish gray color and going in between some of the black and gray spots. Again, building up more depth and adding to the shadow there, so that the bird in general will have more of a three-dimensional form. Adding some of the detail around his face, her face, whatever. Some of what I'm doing with the white is letting little lines show for the feathers, and some of it I'm just burnishing. So I'm both adjusting color and blending anywhere that I add that. So now I'm coming back through and hyping up my contrast and adding more details over here, which is much easier for me to see now that I have the bird's body and head filled in. With that with the Faber-Castell, the ink eraser, I'm able to pull up quite a bit of different dark areas that I have, because again, I had put white down first. It makes it really easy to lift some of the purples and blues off. Softly blending that out with the paint thinner. I don't have a lot on the brush there, and I'm not really scrubbing over it very heavily because I don't want to lose much in the way of details here. And being that that is so soft there, it would be really easy for me to lose some of those pencil lines that are helping create the look of feathers, or that softness up in the upper section of that wing. So again, onto this side, I've got to pay close attention to the lights and the darks, looking at it as abstract shapes. The inside section of the wing here is really fluffy, so I don't have a lot of teeny tiny individual feathers showing like I would on the outer portion of the wing. And just like the other side, I've got to make sure that I get my darks dark enough so that the areas where the sunlight is coming through the wing will really show up. The color I'm using right now is, I can never say it right, caput mortem or something like that with the Polychromos. And that one's kind of a reddish or rose colored brown tone. I use that one a lot too. I layer it on top of my other browns quite a bit so that the browns don't end up too flat. It just gives it a really nice tone when it's combined on top of some of the darker browns. In this case, I like to get all of the little spots on the feathers in first because it helps me to judge which feather I'm working on later on. So while yes, I can work one feather at a time, this helps me know which feather I'm on. Using my violet gray to block in some of the darker sections. You can see as I layer the blue in here, I'm not worrying about a bunch of pencil lines showing all over the place, or I'm not trying to get a sketchy look where I'm creating the look of feathers. It's very soft in there, so I really want a more solid, soft look on a lot of that. So there I was working in smaller section or smaller circles. The darker areas are what I'm using to create the look of feathers. So those ones I'm worrying about which direction those lines are going in. But for the blue, it was just really a shadow, so I could keep it very, very soft. And blending that out with paint thinner. You are shocked, I know. Now this next section starts moving along a little bit faster because I was missing a whole clip of the slow section. So luckily I still had this available. What I'm doing now is going back through and hyping up the contrast. I am just going to keep building and keep building. And at this point I will end up start to skip around on the piece too. I'll go back through and add darker areas on the owl's body and on the other wing. You can see I've really taken that blue and defined it so much better along the outer edge of this wing and then faded it into that violet purple or violet gray. Really defining the contrast here. I've got to get it a lot darker so that the whites will show up. Using that rose color, which helps give the look of sunlight coming through. Now at this point, there are times where I will decide I used a peach color in one area and I think it would balance the owl off better if I pulled it into another part of the wing more strongly. So towards the end, I start kind of steering away from the reference photo a little bit, just as far as what I think will make a better balance for the overall piece. This is where I do a lot of squinting and standing at a distance to see if any one area is standing out to me more than it should. In this case, if part of the orange feathers or the peach feathers stood out too much, if I pull that peach into another area, it'll keep me from being zoned in on that one single spot. You can see I've darkened that wing up quite a bit, and now I'm coming back through with my white luminance and pulling out more of the highlights. Now you can't really see, this is the older camera so it's not as obvious, but a lot of these areas with that white luminance, I'm making sure that I'm getting that frayed look, the sketchy look, so that it looks like feathers. It isn't all perfectly smooth. Better defining feathers in here. Taking that darker blue and hyping up my contrast. And that makes such a big difference. Just going back through now and better defining some of the darks will make the lights that much brighter, which was really important on this piece. Same thing here, defining the blue better, or bringing out a lot of these darks. You can see now I'm being really bold, going a lot darker on the inside section of these wings. It is much less scary to do that now that I have other darker values around it. Earlier on, I was just having a hard time judging my values and it seemed scary. So doing it this way, where I went back later on and darkened everything up, was a lot less frightening. So most of what I'm doing now is coming through and refining detail, getting more of those frayed edges, hyping up the white, making it really stand out in any of the areas where it needs to. And these last steps where I'm going through and adjusting my contrast and values, this is what really pulls this piece together. It doesn't matter how much perfect detail I have everywhere. If my values are incorrect, that's the part that makes such a difference on this. Making sure my lights are light enough and my darks dark enough. I've said this before, there was an artist who I used to follow and her work was so detailed. I mean, beautifully accurate and the detail was amazing, but everything she did was mid-range, so it was very boring to look at. Make sure that you're getting your really light lights and your really dark darks in where they need to go, and that will make your piece so much more interesting for the viewer. And you can see I continued building up, and then having a better photograph makes a big difference, but I kept building up until I had the strong contrast between the lights and the darks on those feathers. And that is it for this piece. If you have any questions, let me know, preferably here on Patreon, because it is way easier for me to keep track of your questions here than it is on YouTube. But let me know if you have any questions, and this was back in December, I believe, that I did this. I will try to remember as much as possible to answer you guys. Thanks for watching.